Hello, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, where I work as an associate professor of sociology. And I'm delighted to introduce a third hour of questions from Introduction to Sociology students at the university asking about sociology, the role it plays, what it can explain, and a few areas in which it isn't able to reach an explanation. Let's listen to these questions and I'll talk about them in this third hour in the series. LG says, LZ, excuse me, LZ says, as you said in Lecture two's first video, everyone develops social skills from a young age, but as we get more older, more aware of the world, do people's social skills change with that in the majority? Do the things around us impact us, or is it our knowledge of more in this world? Yes. There are two kinds of effects that you might look at, okay? And actually, there's more than two, but let's focus on two. One is called a cohort effect, okay? And you might think of this, just as I said earlier in this video, that I joined a graduate school cohort, which is like a class of graduate students. We all went through the experience together. We bonded very strongly. We made lifelong friendships. Similarly, generations are like cohorts. So the ideas that are out there, they haven't gained that much strong support, by the way, empirically, is that everybody from a certain generation has certain similar experiences and therefore sees the world that way, and that's firm and it stays that way for them. Another idea is the idea that people go through a life course. And as they go through a life course, they have different people that they're associated with, different people that they're tied to, and that changes their perspective. And yes, there does seem to be merit in that. People do change their points of view over the life course. However, people also have anchoring biases. That is, disproportionately speaking, if you were raised in a Methodist household, say religiously speaking, you are disproportionately likely to grow up and become a Methodist. If you're a Republican, you're disproportionately likely, if your parents were a Republican, you're disproportionately likely to become a Republican yourself. If your parents were Democrats, you're disproportionately likely to become a Democrat. Do switches happen? Yes. People change their life situations. They learn. They alter their perspectives. But disproportionately, meaning more likely than chance alone would predict, where people end up in terms of their points of view regarding the world are based on these early anchoring experiences that what they were exposed to early in life tends to stick with them. Okay. So that's one aspect of sociality, is the set of cultural values and beliefs that you carry around with you. Okay. So continuing to move on, student AR writes in with this question. AR says, I am wondering how we as a people can use sociology to help minors, M-I-N-O-R-S, young people, understand and recognize the dangers of dating someone older. I see this as a growing problem in schools around me. I see many victims to things that their minor minds simply cannot see and comprehend as they grow in adolescence. Then they ask, would it be possible to require law enforcement to dive even deeper into sociology as part of their schooling or training? What I would note there is that that focus is very psychological. It's about what minds can see and can't see, do see and don't see, do react to and don't react to. And so I would say probably the first person for you to consult on that question would be a psychologist, since you're interested in theories of the mind. And the mind is not really the subject matter of sociology. However, what a sociologist could do is to say, all right, well, let's take a look at patterns here. So one pattern that one might look at is in victimization, okay? And ask, what occurs in terms of victimization? Are people victimized most likely by people who are older than them, by people who are younger than them, or by people who are roughly the same age as them? And one of the neat things is that in this big a society, 330 million people in the United States alone, 8 billion people on the planet. There are some very complicated studies that have been engaged in. One of these is the National Crime Victimization Survey, which looks at the age distributions of offenders and victims. And by the way, the age distributions look very similar. Why is that? Homophily plays a role. We tend to associate with people who are similar to us in age, and most criminal victimizations, not all, but most criminal victimizations occur between people who know each other. So while it is true that dating someone older can possibly have its own unique dangers, one of the things a sociologist would point out is that most victimizations occur between people who know each other, which means that they are roughly of the same ages. Also, one of the things that's most interesting to see is that there is an age crime curve, both in offending and in victimization, which is to say, in more simple language, that there's a certain point in one's life, interesting to think about why, roughly late teens, early 20s, at which committing crimes and becoming a victim of a crime seems to be most likely in a person's life. People in their late teens and early 20s are highly disproportionately represented among criminal victims and criminal offenders. And trying to figure out what it is about age that does this is a central focus of a number of criminologists, including an emeritus professor of sociology, Travis Hershey, who coined a phrase to describe a regularity we find in society. There's something called the age crime curve, an example of which you see here. CL writes, I've always wondered how a judge, lots of criminality in judge cases, questions here, how a judge working a dispute case between two different parties uses sociology to determine the outcome within the case. What I mean by that is, if two people are neighbors and they can both be held responsible, how do they decide what decision to make based on sociology, like history within the community, history with each other, how they've interacted with each other, etc.? Here's what I'd say in answer to that question. Well, first of all, I'm not a judge or a professional judge, and in my research, studying judges is not something I do. So I would leave that to someone else to decide more fully whether judges refer to sociology or not, and to what extent they do so. Although it is the case that law schools from which judges graduate are more and more looking for people in various social science majors, including sociology, to apply to graduate school so that they can do so more often. And so the American Bar Association and other legal groups have statements about this. However, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind about sociology is that sociology studies patterns. It provides answers about patterns across multiple cases. And it describes those in terms of tendencies. Most social patterns are not hard and fast rules that occur for every individual without fail, because human beings are complicated organisms that have a combination of pressures put upon them and choices that they make. And there are whole fields that study the variety of that. Sociology does not, therefore, provide answers about single cases. So just because you know the overall pattern doesn't mean that you always know all the reasons that any one person or two people, like neighbors, do what they do. So sociology really doesn't touch on telling stories about single people. We study patterns across large numbers of people. And so if I were put in a courtroom and asked to testify, that's one of the first things I would say. Well, MSP now asks, a similar question to what someone asked before. One major question I have regarding sociology is how social structures influence our day-to-day life. How do we recognize that these specific structures are important in our everyday life? Okay, so I've touched on some aspects of these, but let me answer this question in a different way. If I were going to seek to encourage you to recognize the social structures that surround you, I'm going to ask you to take a pad of paper and a pencil and to devote one day of your life to looking for social structures and products of social structures. So, how many things, objects that surround you in your daily life, were made entirely by you, entirely independently? And how many were made by someone else? Or were made by you, but with elements that were supplied by someone else? And my guess is the vast majority of those things that surround you are in that latter case, unless you're a very unusual person in our modern society. We rely on a very defined division of labor between people. We have so many different kinds of people out there. And in order for the things that produce the environment that you're in order for those things to exist and then to be distributed across the society, you rely on a huge number of people occupying distinct positions to do their job, to fill their role expectation. And if they don't do it, you don't have tables, you don't have chairs, you don't have computers, you don't have clothes, you don't have the internet, you don't have windows, you don't have ceilings, you don't have floors. So many things you don't have. So much so that it is impossible now in our modern life for one person to be a jack of all trades and make all the things that surround a typical modern American. The second thing I'd ask you to do is to look for groups. Look for sets of more than one person and to write down patterns of their interaction. You can see patterns in how people interact. Who speaks to who doesn't speak to whom, who touches who gives goods to who receives goods from whom. All of those are relationships, patterns of relationships that surround people in their daily lives. Look for them and then write them down as you go. You'll be surprised how quickly you fill page after page after page after page. You might just make it through 20 minutes before you say, I've had enough, I've seen enough social structures. They're all around us. And they're all around us every day so often that we tend to forget they're there. It's like, as Judith Lorber once put it, it's like a fish being in water. If they've been in water their whole life, they just don't pay attention to the fact, oh, look, water. You get used to it. The key is to look at the world around you as if you're seeing it for the first time. And a great way to do that is to give yourself a particular task, like to describe all the objects around you. And were they made by you? Made by someone you know? Made by someone you don't know? And then again, what are the patterns of interaction around you? That's what I would do. That's how I would recognize that there are specific structures that exist that impact our daily life. Okay, AB asks about artificial intelligence. Sorry, that's computing and psychology. Other than knowing about ChatGPT, just like you do, I don't know that much more about it. Okay, but AB nevertheless goes on to say, AI is becoming more intelligent and popular as time goes on. Since many people are using this technology to improve many types of things, how do you expect social interaction and overall society to change with this development? I don't yet know. I think there are many possible ways that it could change things and how social interaction could change. So I feel comfortable saying I don't know. I've seen a lot of movies with AI in them, and they end in very different ways. So, as a sociologist, though, I would note this. Social interaction is something that doesn't strictly require humanity to occur. All that is required for social interaction to happen is that there be two entities. They could be ants, they could be chickens, they could be dogs, they could be horses, or cows, or people, or robots, or computers. Any two things that have the capacity to interact, to behave in such a fashion that what this unit does changes something in this unit. It could be talking. Talking changes us, what we know, what we hear, what we do. It could be forceful behavior, such as violence. There are all kinds of ways that units can interact. We can study how AIs interact as long as we can identify the individual units and we can characterize what the interaction is between them. As a matter of fact, social network analysis, which has been used most centrally by sociologists to study mathematical patterns of how humans relate to each other, is also used by computer scientists to characterize computer networks and the behavior that occurs in computer networks. Computer scientists already do this. Biologists do this. They use social network analysis to study the interaction of proteins inside your body and how that leads to the production of things like fingers and noses and things that come from noses and all kinds of stuff like that. Relational analysis, of which sociology is a part, doesn't have to be strictly human to be effective. But I'm going to have to wait and see because I'm not an expert in AI in any regard. MG, does the age you start working affect your work ethic? I don't know. I think it depends on what you mean by that question. Is it a generational question? Does the year that you began working and ideas of work tend to be something that you remember? Yes. Is how old you were when you were starting working affect your work ethic? Well, yes, it's associated with it, although we'd have to determine, is it the fact that you started working at a particular age or that you were a member of a family in which having a job early is especially valued, promoted, and the children in that family are pushed into it? The answer is yes. We are affected by what we do. Work is one of those things. And the path that we follow in life is based on both the lessons we learn and the experiences we have when we are young. It's absolutely true. Okay, here's another question. Another series of questions. Here's a big one. NW asks, how does urbanization impact social relationships and social behavior? Okay, so I'm going to give you two answers. One from the 1930s and one from the early 1980s. Oldies but goodies. Lewis Wirth, a sociologist, publishes in the American Journal of Sociology a piece called Urbanism as a Way of Life, and describes what is later termed as a mass society theory, which is the idea that as places get larger, that certain differences emerge in the social environment. First, you get division of labor, which means that you get more people doing different kinds of jobs, as opposed to mostly people doing similar jobs, right? This is the idea of mechanical versus organic solidarity, which we've talked about before. Also points out that there's a lot of diversification that occurs in urban places where people become different from one another. Finally, Lewis Wirth notes that it is possible for people to become lonely in cities. Why do people become lonely in cities? Lewis Wirth argues people can become lonely in cities because the people that they talk to, they don't tend to see again and again and again in different contexts. And those people may not know one another. So if all of your friends know each other, it's hard to fall out of friendships, right? Because your relationships with other people bring you back in contact with those people. And it doesn't occur so much in big cities, according to Lewis Wirth. But Claude Fisher comes around in the 1980s and studies a number of towns in California, which is where his academic work was located. And he writes this book called To Dwell Among Friends, Personal Networks in Towns and Cities. And he points out that, yes, cities become big places, but one of the things that people do to respond to that is that they make smaller units of people who still know each other in those big cities. They make tiny little clumps of high density, whether it's a neighborhood organization or people who all go to the same barbershop or something else that brings those people together. A religious institution, an educational institution, something like that. People make small towns out of big cities. Now, the way they do that, and then they create meaning and these tight connections of people. The way they do that is because we can only maintain so many social ties, is that they cut off their ties to everybody else. Which means that for Fisher, what you get is a lot of connections and meaningful connections and friendships and meaningful social interaction that occurs. However, you get huge chasms between these different clumps so that they're segregated from one another, separated socially from one another, because people turn their ties inward and ignore others, which means that at the same time, a big city can be a place of connection, but also division. Okay. Writes, what is the importance of having sociology in modern times? Wow. And second, how does sociology impact our everyday life? So for that second question, I'd go back to the student who said, wow, how can we see social structures? I'd say, pick up a pad of paper and think about the objects in the room around you, and then write down information about patterns of interaction you see in everyday life, and you will find them. What's the importance of having sociology in modern times? I would say the importance is especially strong given one tendency, which is that the larger our societies become, the more, this is George Ritzer in his book, The McDonaldization of Society, he points out, the more that our societies have become driven by the imperative to organize everything. The more people you have around, the harder it is to organize them, to administer them, to run a society. Easier to run a society with 10 people than it is to organize 10 million people. And so we tend to get hierarchical, have administrative structures. And then those administrative structures have their own imperatives. They want to run well. So they organize themselves, according to George Ritzer, along principles of efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control of the people that fall underneath them. Very much like the social organization of a McDonald's, a set of rules that create more efficiency, that make all of your actions calculable. So McDonald's supervises its employees and watches everything they do. They quantify everything they do in order to predict what their employees will do in a calculable way, and therefore to control the behavior of those underneath them. So that's a development in modern times, as we have moved from very small groups, and in the course of a couple hundred years, moved into very large cities that just didn't exist in the size and scale that they are in now. Meaning that we have a different social experience in modern times as a result. Okay. MW asks a question, how does our social class and background growing up affect our chances and opportunities later in life? That's a great question because it's an empirical question. It's a question that we can answer through observation. And I would call up some mobility tables, which display a particular form of social structure. And when we look at, let's look at a particular mobility table, which is looking at mobility, right? You're talking about growing up. You're talking about moving from one generation to the next. Does what your parents experience affect what you experience? Okay, and so a mobility table, this is by Ji Song, Emma Zhang, Kenneth Land, and Boyang Zheng in Research in Social Stratification and Mobility in 2022. A very recent publication, and in which they're talking about mobility tables, and they introduce them. And let me show one to you. When we're looking at this table, one of the things that you'll notice about it is, okay, this is table 4 here, is that you have in columns, okay, first the top table has sons income quintile group, and then the second table down has daughters income quintile group. And then horizontal rows are the parents income quintile group in both cases. Okay, so what the heck is an income quintile group? Okay, notice the quintiles are set into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Quint is a prefix meaning 5. It's groups of 5. Notice, secondly, that in the horizontal rows, the quintiles are described as the bottom 20%, second 20%, middle 20%, fourth 20%, and top 20%. Notice they're all 20%. So this is what a quintile is, and we're going to talk about this in a week on economic stratification. This is a social structure. It's one in which you can take a look at these 20% units among parents, okay? And it's as if you line everybody up according to their income, from lowest income to highest income, right? And imagine there's 100 parents that you line up. If you want to get 20% of 100, you'd take 20 parents. So you'd take the 20 lowest income parents, and they would be the bottom 20% of the quintile. Then you take the next 20, the ones that are not quite the poorest, but the next two ones, and that's quintile group 2, the second 20%. And then so on until you get to the 20 parents who have the highest incomes of all the 100 parents. And those would be in the top 20%. You do the same in the United States, which this is about because it's a panel study of income dynamics. And what you can see is that you could do the same with hundreds of millions of people. You just divide them into equal numbers of people, sets of 20%, fifths. 5 times 20 is 100. So what they're saying in this table, let's talk about sons first, is that the bottom 20% of parents, the 20% of parents in terms of the parents' income, well, they grow up and occasionally they have children, and sometimes they have sons and sometimes they have daughters. In the sons table, when we look at the sons of the parents in the bottom 20%, what percentage of the sons end up also in the bottom quintile group, the lowest 20%? Group 1, 48.7% of them do. What percentage go all the way up to the top income quintile from having parents in the bottom? Only 3.4%. Now, here's the leap. If you imagine a world in which it doesn't matter what your parents do in terms of your life chances, since every income quintile group is 20%, adding to 100 among the parents, right? Then we would expect 20% of the sons to end up at the bottom, 20% to end up in the second quintile, 20% to end up in the third middle income quintile, 20% of the children of the lowest income to end up in the next to highest group, and 20% of the sons of the parents in the lowest income group to also end up in the highest income group. We'd expect that to be 20% all around, but it's not. The sons of the bottom 20% are disproportionately concentrated in the bottom quintile, and also more likely than chance alone. Chance alone is 20%. 24.3%, a little bit more likely than chance alone, end up in that second group, the group that's next to it. So to the extent that there's intergenerational mobility in how your relative income, it moves us within about one group. The chances of a son from a low income family moving to a top income family is much lower than 20%, 3.4% in this study. And notice it's fairly similar for the daughters. This is in the first horizontal row in the bottom table. Also notice that this holds for the second 20%, the middle 20%, and the fourth 20%. What is most likely the biggest number in each of those rows is the same quintile. Same quintile. Same quintile. And so it goes for the top 20%. If you were born as a child, let's say a son to start with, to parents in the top 20%, you only have a 7.9% chance of ending up in the bottom quintile. But you have a 42% chance of ending up yourself in the top quintile. For daughters, if you're a daughter of parents of the top income quintile, you only have a 4.9% chance of dropping all the way to the bottom and a 45% chance of staying in the top 20%. What that represents is some mobility, most mobility to an adjacent category, but disproportionately people stay in the same income category relative to others as their parents started in. So if you were to say, it doesn't matter who your parents are, That's a false statement. While it's also a false statement that says people who are born poor have no chance of becoming really high income, because that does occasionally happen, but it happens much less often than chance alone predicts. So, mobility tables are a great way of summarizing social structure, even though there are demographers, people who study, and economic sociologists, people who study how people move throughout life and how their economic situations change. They will argue about what the best way to visualize a social structure might be. This is a pretty intuitive way to do it. Okay. EH. Why is re-entering society as someone who has faced time in jail such an insane process socially? Okay, so I'll take the word insane out and just say difficult. Okay, it's difficult because our cultures, for a few reasons. First of all, cultures are local. Cultures vary according to the community you're in, and what someone experiences when they move from living outside a jail to moving inside a jail or a prison or other corrections facility, and then moving back to out, is a huge cultural adjustment, because the cultures inside a prison and inside a jail are very different from those outside a jail. Number one. Number two, we'll be reading a piece of research later on in the semester by Deva Pager, who is a late sociologist, no longer with us, who studied something called the mark of a criminal record, in which it's found that if there are two people who are applying for a job and they're otherwise equally qualified on paper, but one acknowledges that they had committed a felony on paper and the other one doesn't, but otherwise they're exactly the same, the probability that the person who's convicted of a felony being hired for that position is much lower. We'll see later in class how much lower it is, much lower than someone who is a non-felon. There are ways to play with those probabilities, by the way. One of them is to allow the person's cued racial category to change. You can do that by changing the person's name. If a person has a highly racialized white name versus a highly racialized black name, and they're otherwise equally qualified, what happens? What happens if one of them is also has the mark of a criminal record on their job application, indicating that they had been convicted of a felony? What if they're not? There's actual research by sociologists on the patterns that emerge when there are real jobs out there that these applications go out for by real employers. What do those real employers do? How do they treat those individual people differently? Treating people differently according to the category they occupy is called discrimination. And one of the things we'll show is that discrimination absolutely occurs. KB, why do people in different societies put more or less pressure on their young to learn certain things in school and play a certain sport or not another? Well, a quick answer is that one of the things that early social experiences do is they shape our identification, our idea of ourself, who we are, what we're capable of doing, and where we belong. So parents, since time immemorial, have put their children in social environments that help to prepare them for the futures that their parents imagine for their kids. Whether that's successful or matches what the child actually wants to do is an open question. But that's what early social experience is all about. There are different kinds of socialization. One of them is called primary socialization, and it's between people who are highly, intimately, emotionally connected on a frequent basis. We call these people families, right? Usually. People who spend a whole lot of time together, interact with each other intensely, and impact one another's identities in a very strong core way. Then there's the secondary socialization that occurs when there are people that we interact with in a less emotionally intense way, but can help develop certain skills and not others. And one of the things that parents do is to anticipate what those skills might be and to put their children in situations outside of the primary socialization of the family to socialize in a secondary way that they believe will prepare their children for the futures that they imagine for them. Okay. KB asks, how might the ongoing Writers Guild of America strike have an effect on other worker strikes in the future? That's a big question. Okay, so there are many possible answers to this question. And I think you're going to find that people start to write pieces of research on the Writers Guild of America strike. But a really interesting question behind this is does the existence of one strike have a relationship on other strikes? Do they occur in waves? And there are two researchers, Jennifer Earle and Sarah Sewell, who with other researchers have asked this question, summarized most broadly in an annual review of sociology piece called The Use of Newspaper Data in the Study of Collective Action. And one of the things they've looked at is whether news about things like strikes or protests or other kind of social movement activities, protest activities, whether the appearance of newspaper articles indicates or provokes a spread. And they find that it's very effective to look at newspapers, to put it briefly, as indicators of social movement activity. So that's a good place for you to read to look at that question. Although, particularly for the particular case of the ongoing Writers Guild of America strike, and whether that has effects on other strikes, any one case I hesitate to make a prediction about. But Jen Earle and Sarah Sewell have a lot of great research that describes the spread of the word about what they call collective action, which could be protest movements, could be religious movements, could be labor strikes, that the roles that newspapers spread as communication mediums in helping to provoke similar activities occurring. Okay, LM. How much of the information and opinions that we consume from the internet are truly our own opinions, and not just because of anchoring bias or framing bias? I don't know the answer to that question, LM, because I don't know how we would tag information as being ours and our own. And I say that in all seriousness, right? What am I saying to you right now? I'm saying words, none of which I defined, right? So I had to learn them from someone else. How do I understand news off the internet, which describes events, which describes groups, which describes places? I have to learn about them first. And my learning about them changes my perception of them. Are they truly my own opinions? I don't know. Okay, let's try to move on from not knowing. There's an article that you're going to read later in the semester by Solomon Asch. And he was confronted by something similar. He was reacting to World War II and the fact that a lot of people got hurt in World War II, were terribly abused, both individuals and communities, and millions of people killed. One of the big questions coming out of World War II is, why did that happen? How often does that happen? And how do entire nations of people turn against one another or turn internally upon subpopulations within themselves? Well, it's a big question. And Solomon Asch says, I'm not sure I can answer that big question. So he starts to look for a smaller question. And he says, okay, what's a question that I can manage, that I can work around, and that I can study? And he says, okay, how about people's perceptions of reality? How about that? And he says, let's do something simple. And he comes up with the length of lines. You know, like here's a line and here's a line. Which one's taller, right? This one looks taller than this one, right? So some things look obvious. And he goes through and he studies how people are able to measure lines. And he finds out on their own, left to themselves, they're pretty accurate. When accuracy is compared to someone taking a ruler and measuring it, people are really good at identifying which line is the longest out of a set of 3 lines. But then he creates a situation, Solomon Asch does, is a 20th century sociologist. He asks people to come in front of his research subject and in the same room as his research subject to say ridiculous things, like that the shortest line is actually the longest. And he gets the real research subjects who have listened to these pronouncements, gets them to change their reports, that they begin to report very strange things. Even though they previously had been very good at measuring the length of a line accurately and identifying the longest line, they started identifying the shortest line as the longest line. Social situations can occur in which this occurs. And the key is to understand when it is more likely to occur and when it is less likely to occur. The answer is you vary the social structure around a person in very systematic ways, and you can change that person's behavior so that they begin to utter opinions that they previously didn't hold at all about something as simple as the length of a line. We will read this in the future, and I'm going to leave the identification of the social structures to that unit. But look ahead for it. It's going to be an interesting time in class. AC asks, what's literally a simple question. In what way do your siblings influence your personality or you as a person? The same way others do, by spending time around you and influencing your view of the world. But they are part of your primary group. A set of people, assuming that you live with your siblings, who live with you, you spend time every day with them when you're younger, and therefore they influence you. They change the way that you see the world in a very strong way, more strongly than a secondary group would. ED asks, how could members within a community protect and support other members from abusive households? That's an interesting word. Does this connect the community together, or does it overstep personal boundaries within specific families? So it's interesting that you mention families and households, because families are, like I just mentioned, domains of primary socialization, frequent contact, intimate contact, emotional contact that affects the formation of a young person's self. The word abuse, use means use, and ab means incorrect use of. So the idea of abuse is that one is taking one's role within a primary socialization context and using it for ends that are not proper according to some external standard. So there's a larger community that exists that has a different set of standards, right? And what this is about is it's about the tension of the standards of a family and of the community around them regarding that family. So, Emil Durkheim, who I mentioned before, said one of the interesting things that communities do is that they identify certain individuals and certain groups as belonging inside the accepted set, and they identify certain individuals and groups as belonging outside. And so Emil Durkheim says to do so, to accept some and to reject others, is a way to articulate the standards of a community. And in so doing, to draw the community that stays within the lines of acceptedness closer together, to give them common identity, a shared sense of who they are as a group by who they exclude. Whether it's justified in your mind or not, whether we call that abuse or whether we call that creating pariahs, is a matter that's for a moral academic, of which I'm not one. For those within the group, it connects them closer together. For those that are pushed out of the group, it isolates. And that in that one act of defining the standards, it involves some, brings some closer together, and excludes others. It does both, according to Durkheim's perspective as a sociologist. Whether you call that appropriate or inappropriate is based on what? your culture, your set of values and beliefs, beliefs about the way that the world is, and values which describe how you believe the world ought to be, expressed as expectations for behavior, right? Which is all about what happens when we identify families that are not operating the way that we expect as a culture that they should. So it's all about culture. It's all about socialization. And it's an interesting question. BS. Do communities benefit from public gardens? If so, in what ways do they benefit? Oh, I say this as a former head of a community garden at the University of Maine at Augusta for many years. Public gardens in which the public works on them together bring people together. They decrease loneliness. They increase connections between people in ways where people find themselves able to rely on other people, so they gain social support. They also generate real benefit. The garden that I was in grew vegetables for the food pantry, which was able to give fresh vegetables to families that didn't have much food. So that's 3 ways of benefit. 4th way of benefit, I was able to teach sociology in the garden. It was a really fun thing to do while it lasted. There are so many kinds of benefits. We benefit from social groups because they create context in which we establish a meaning and a place for ourselves as individuals, and in which we seek to serve our larger community. That's one of the great things that groups in societies can do. GP asks, how do public green spaces within towns and cities affect social groups and relationships? Does being surrounded by nature and biodiversity affect how humans interact with each other? GP asks this, they say, since I am currently working on a thesis in the realm of biodiversity and public green spaces within an urban setting, I'm curious to see if there is an additional research I can conduct to strengthen my thesis. So, what I'm going to recommend you do is to head to answer this question, to a website called Google Scholar, which is available at scholar.google.com. It is a search engine for what? For published peer-reviewed research on a subject. Now, this is really niche. I told you that I coordinated a community garden as a sociologist, and yet I do not know whether the biodiversity of public spaces has a demonstrated impact on social groups and relations. But if I type biodiversity, put public spaces in as a phrase through use of quotes, and write interaction, I find there are 25,000 published research results. Okay. And so I would encourage you to use that search term and look at some of these published research articles to begin your own literature review on the subject and see what aspects are found. And you'll find that there's a lot of research on the subject. Research that, unfortunately, I, as a particular sociologist, don't know much about. There are 3 more questions that relate to an earlier question on mobility tables. HD asks, what is the probability that a child will end up in the same career path as their parent or guardian? We've already seen that in mobility tables. It's disproportionately high. LB, my question is, to what extent does our social class background affect our chances in the future? LB says they feel like there's no right answer for this because they think anyone could have a bad social class but still manage to have a good life in the future. That's a contention, that's a hypothesis, but we know from the mobility tables that you've seen, which covered all the way from the late 60s to, I believe, 2017, it covered a wide swath of American history, and across that period, it's true that somebody could have social class origins of being raised in a disproportionately poor family, and they could end up having a really high income in the future, but disproportionately speaking, that is far less likely than chance would predict to occur. And what happens most often is that people end up in a same or similar situation as their parents. And knowing that that occurs, just descriptively speaking, means that we know that people don't randomly move from one generation to another within families in terms of their destination and their origin. People stay close to their origins. And that should influence the way we think about what it means to be born into a family. Something to think about. What is the correlation between a parent's relationship with their child and academic performance? Okay, now that's a slightly different question. It's also one I don't know much about because I'm not a family sociologist. I don't study families in my own research work. I would encourage you, similarly to GP, to head to scholar.google.com. And if you want to start to look at this, I don't know what you mean by parents' relationship with their child. Does that mean do they live in the same house? Does that mean that they get along together? Does it mean that they talk about academics a lot? Because this is about academic performance. I'd want to hear more about that. But I would suggest that you go to scholar.google.com, that you type in academic performance, put it in quotes as a phrase, so that the words occur together in the results, and then enter the term parents and child and relationship. And I would start to look at articles that describe different kinds of relationships, because you haven't described what kind of relationship you're interested in, and look until you find one that's interesting to you and start to then hone your search in on that kind of relationship, and you'll find some research that has something to tell you. I can't be the person to tell you that right now because that's not an area of my expertise, but I can tell you where to look. TE asks, how can a person be so understanding in their daily choose on social work? Or how can a person be so outstanding with someone's achievements? Plus, how can someone overcome social work? Okay, so here's a point at which I don't understand this question. I don't know what these questions mean. And what that indicates to me is that we have a cultural gap. That TE, the way that you're using these words, aren't in sets of meanings that I'm familiar with, and therefore I don't understand them. What that indicates is that there's a social distance between us that hasn't been closed, at least yet. One of the things that people do when they talk to each other is that they learn each other's vocabulary. So, TE, because I'm not answering your question, because I don't understand it, I invite you to come visit me during office hours. My office hours are every Wednesday from 9 to 3 via Zoom link that I've sent to you since you joined the class. And give me a call or Zoom in, and we can have a bigger conversation about this. Okay. A similar non-answer is going to come from SP's question. Do you think that the age in which children are given access to technology affects their ability to learn? Do you think as an adult our brains are affected every day the more we use technology? Ooh, my goodness. Ability to learn and brains. That's psychology. That's outside my field. I don't really know. I mean, I can tell you what I've experienced as a person, but that's not me talking as a sociologist. So I'll leave that question to the psychologists. Fortunately, however, there are some fields in which I do work, and so in which I can share some answers. And one of them is in social media. I have published research in the area of humans interacting through social media. So there are 6 questions about that. Let me just read them and then try to talk about them all together. SN says, social media has really taken over the world the last few years. As far back as I can remember, social media has made major impacts on every portion of my life in many ways. What behaviors are influenced by social media, and how is it affecting socialization offline? We covered that in the previous question. We know that people who use social media more have higher social anxiety, and they also report themselves as being more lonely. What we don't know is whether it's the loneliness and anxiety that is leading people to join social media, or whether it's the use of social media yet that generates loneliness and anxiety. It's about the order in which they happen. Which comes before the other? We don't know yet. RG asks, how big of an impact has social media had on mental health issues and suicide rates in females versus males from the ages of 10 to 25 in the last 15 years? I am not a mental health expert. I'm not a psychologist. So I'm going to hold off on that, since that's a psychological question. So I'm gonna set that question to the side. HR. Why has bullying, more recently cyberbullying, become such a social trend in recent years? And what is the predicted impact on future generations if this trend continues? HR, I'd say I'm much less confident in my ability to make conclusions about that. One reason is because social media is so recent, that it is a new social phenomenon. As recently as a decade and a half ago, social media was not something that anybody but a small portion of people in the world used. And now it is something that large majorities of people are using in all sorts of industrialized societies. So we haven't had a lot of time to be able to identify a trend other than increasing use of social media. Second, I'd want to know what you mean by bullying or cyberbullying. How would you know cyberbullying when you saw it? And what do you mean by it? By cyberbullying, do you mean people saying negative things about each other? Do you mean people pushing people to do things that they would not otherwise normally do? Coercing them into different behaviors? I'd want to hear more about what you mean by bullying and cyberbullying. And then we'd look at that particular variable to see if that's changed over the very small period of time that social media has been a major force in our world. And when we're thinking about impact on future generations, we have hardly had one generation that has been social media natives. Since social media didn't exist the way it does now as early as 15 years ago. And we tend not to study youth as systematically as we do adults. Why? Because youth are not able to consent to academic studies in the same easy way that adults can. And they're a protected population. So I actually don't know the answer to that. Partially because I'm not sure what you mean by cyberbullying, and partially because we've had so little time to study this that I'm not quite sure that we know that it is a trend that is different than, say, the bullying that has happened for generations. As long as there have been people, there seems to be bullying in real life, offline situations. So it'd be difficult to compare. Okay. KF asks about the impact of social media on mental health, especially young people. I'm going to beg off on that because I'm not a psychologist. And so my main interest is not in what happens inside people's heads. And my expertise is certainly not in that area. But a great question to ask a psychologist. Also a great question to ask a psychologist comes from LG. Is it possible for social media to affect your sense of time and contribute to losing your sense of reality over time? Oh, that's all in here. That's psychology. Okay. SS says, with social media apps like TikTok becoming more popular as a career choice for youth as influencers, how might this impact the youth pursuing further education after high school? How will that impact the future workforce and essential careers like health and retail? Okay, this much I do know, is that there's a variety of variation called structural mobility, which is in changes in jobs. And we know that changes in jobs happen from generation to generation all the time. So when my grandfather was born in 1897 in a sod house made out of literally sod taken from the earth in Nebraska, he was born to a farm family when most Americans were farmers. And he was young enough to be my grandfather. So much has happened over that last 100 years in terms of the careers that are available to people and how education happens. That's right within a century's time. That I do not feel confidence in predicting the future when it comes to future work, especially because the pace of technological change is so strong. We have smartphones that it used to take an entire room of computers when I was a child. The smartphone can do what a whole room of computers could not do when I was young. So, what do I know about what's going to happen in 30 years? Not much. Also, I'm an empiricist, which means I look at what has happened. I am not sure how many young people there are who have a career, a paying career, that funds their lifestyle as an influencer. However, one of the places that I could go to look this up is the Bureau of Labor Statistics at bls.gov. And I could look at a table of occupations. And that table number that I want to look at is actually table 1.2 for a bunch of people who know much more about occupations than I do. And that will take you to employment by detailed occupation in 2022 and projected in 2032, which is kind of in the future. And what you'll see here is a long list of occupations: fundraisers, computer support specialists, and the lists go down and down. Every row is a different occupation. And in 2022, these occupations get an employment matrix code because they have sufficient numbers of people who are working in it. If I search for influencer, I find no row among the many, 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 many rows of this table that describes the work of influencers. So what that tells me is a couple of things. First of all, that the role of an influencer as a career is so small as to not be represented in this table of hundreds of rows of occupations. So in 2022, the occupation of influencer appears really small. It's very niche. Second, since it's so small right now, we really don't have enough numbers to be able to extrapolate to what goes on as so far as 10 years from now. Now, we could use all kinds of alternatives. We could look for social media, but even social media work, it's not listed as an occupation right now. I know there are people who do work as social media managers, but right now it's a relatively niche form of communication management. And we do know that communication is a field that people work in. There are 12 occupations I know from a quick search that feature communication in their work. What I would suggest to you is that you start there. Think about the communication occupations that we know exist today, and think about how TikTok as a particular platform or social media as a more general platform might possibly interact with that in the future. For now, though, the TikTok influencing as a career is actually quite small. So small that it does not appear in the Bureau of Labor Statistics' rather voluminous tables. I hope that all of these questions have been helpful to you in them being posed. Some of them are outside the realm of sociology, and so I'll politely defer to experts in different fields in that regard. But most of these questions, sociology has some purchase on, some way of addressing. And I hope you come away from this question and answer session with an appreciation of the real diversity of questions that you can ask using sociology.